All right, please be seated. Sir, you can take off your mask now. All right, Mr. Storino, you may continue. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Nunnery, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Sir, when we broke for lunch, I was asking you questions about being paid by Fred Bell. Yes. And you paying $15,000 to Mr. Span. Yes. So that's where we'll pick up. You said you gave this money to Mr. Span at a gas station. Yes. And you said he had some people with him? Yes. And you indicated that you would get the rest of the money? Yes. You had hoped you'd get the rest of the money? Yes. Now, you also testified before lunch that you called Mr. Bell countless times? Yes. Did you eventually have a meeting with both Mr. Bell and this other person you mentioned, Doug? Yes. Just to remind the ladies and gentlemen, who is Doug in relation to Fred Bell? Doug is the guy that Fred worked for. And they were both CVLs? Yes. How long after the murder of Mr. Rangel do you believe you had this meeting with Fred and Doug? Maybe a month or two. How did the meeting come about? I saw Doug riding down the street when I was at the apartment on Laramie, and I flagged him down and asked him what was going on with the money. And what did Doug say? He told me that he didn't have nothing to do with it, that was on Fred. And I told him that Fred already let me know that he was the one who was supposed to have been getting the money. And he goes like, well, we need to set up a meeting between me, you, and Fred. Did Doug agree? Yeah. And did you eventually meet? Yes. Where did that meeting occur? Downtown it was right off of Orleans. I don't know which street, maybe Erie. Do you mean downtown, like in the Loop in Chicago? Yeah, yes. Close to the Loop? Yes. And who was present for this meeting? Me, Fred, Doug, and a couple of Doug's friends, but I don't know them. Did you know them? No, I don't know them. And what did you, Fred, and Doug discuss at this meeting? We discussed the payment for the murder. What did you say to them, and what did Fred and Doug say to you? Well, I was asking Doug what's the problem, where's the money, and he was telling me that, he didn't have nothing to do with it, and that it was all on Fred, basically. And I told him, well, if you don't tell me, if you don't come up with the money within a week, then I'm going to tell LaBar that you the one playing with the money. When you said LaBar, you're referring to Mr. Span? Yeah. And you said that to Fred or Doug or both? Both. What did they say in response? Doug said, well, he was going to try to get on top of it and see what's going on. So what's the holdup or whatever for me? And Doug previously denied being involved? Yes. And after you said that, Doug said he would try to get the money? Yes. Did you have another conversation with Doug about the money? Yes. When was that? Maybe a week or so later. And where was that conversation? At a funeral for a guy that I know named Forehead. Forehead? Like touching my forehead? Yeah. Okay. And what did you and Doug discuss at the funeral? I asked him what was going on, and he told me that he might be able to come up with 5 kilos of cocaine as payment. So Doug offered to pay you in a different way? Yeah. Now, at a certain point, do you know if Doug got arrested? Yeah. Yeah, like maybe a month or so after that. To be clear, was that arrest for something unrelated to the murder of Mr. Rangel? Yes. Did you continue to ask Mr. Bell for the money after Doug was arrested? Yes. Sometime after Forehead's funeral, did you meet with Mr. Span about the money? Yes. Where did you meet with Mr. Span? On Laramie. Who was present? Me and him and Pierre, probably. Now, at a certain point, yeah, Pierre. Go ahead. Now, at a certain point, do you know if Pierre was killed in the summer of 2003? Yes. Do you know when? No, I don't know the exact date. So if you think Pierre was there, I assume this meeting was before Pierre's death? Yeah. And were you alone? Yeah. And you said it was on Laramie? Yeah. Did you meet in your backyard or in... Yeah, the backyard. Where the gravel was? Yes. What did you say to Mr. Span, and what did he say to you? Well, I was telling him, that Fred was trying to get the money or whatever, and he was like, man, I'm going to have to Fred up if you don't come up with that money. And who said that? Bro, man. What did you understand him to mean when he said, I'm going to Fred up? Kill Fred. Now, at this point, you had paid Mr. Span $15,000. Yeah. Did you ever pay him any more money? Yeah, maybe $2,000 more, maybe. Is that money you received from Fred or Doug? No. Where did you get that money? Out of my pocket. Mr. Nunnery, at the beginning of your testimony, we discussed a person named Mario Young. Yes. And if you would just remind the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, does Mr. Young go by a nickname? Rio. And you've known Mr. Young for some time? Yes. And do you associate Mr. Young with a gang? Yes. Which gang? Unknown Vice Lords. Same as you? Yeah. Now, do you remember a time after the murder of Mr. Rangel where you met with Mr. Young in person? Yes. And where was that meeting? Inside my apartment on Laramie. And why were you meeting with Mr. Young on that date? Just to catch up, just talking. And again, you were both unknown Vice Lords. Yes. And who was present for this conversation? Me, Rio, and one of his friends named Yeti. Yeti? Is that Yethe? Yes. And you said he was one of Rio's friends? Yeah. Did you associate Yeti with a gang? Yes. Which gang? He was an unknown Vice Lord also. Now, at this time in 2003, did you know if Mr. Young had recently been released from custody? Yes. Do you know if he was in federal or state custody? He was in federal custody. Did you trust Mr. Young at this time? No. Why not? Because I didn't buy his explanation for how he got out. What do you mean you didn't buy it? I didn't believe him. What do you mean by got out? When he explained how he bonded out of federal custody, I didn't believe him. And did that cause you concern? Yes. What concern did you have? That maybe he might be working. Working with who? The feds. The federal government? Yeah. Were you careful around him? Kind of, yeah. Now, to be clear, at the time of this conversation, you didn't know for a fact if Mr. Young, no, was working? No. Years later, did you learn whether or not Mr. Young was cooperating with the federal government? Yes. What did you learn? I learned that he had been wearing a wire for the federal government from the time of his release. And did you learn that Mr. Young had recorded your conversation with him on this date? Yes. And did you have the opportunity to hear that recording? Yes. First, years ago? Yes. Do you know when you first heard and received the recording? I first heard the recording the day that I was arrested, and then later on at my trial. So the recording that we're talking about was part of your case in Cook County? Yes. Where you were convicted for the murder of Mr. Rangel? Yes. And prior to your testimony here today, have you had the opportunity to hear that recording again? Yes. Did I play it for you? Yes. And did I also draft a transcript and give you the opportunity to review it? Yes. And did you review it? Yes. And did you make changes to it? Yes. Your Honor, Government Exhibit 519 is already in evidence, the recording as is the transcript. I would ask the jurors to flip to tab 519, and can I have one moment to get the binder for the witness? Sure. So, Mr. Nunnery, for the record, I've handed you a copy of the transcript, Government Exhibit 519. Do you have it there in front of you? Yes. So across the top of the page at line 1, what is the date listed on the top of this transcript? 7/23/2003. July 23rd? Yeah. And where it says speakers on lines 5, 6, and 7, what are the speakers listed there? Myself, Mario, and Yeti. Now, you testified that you've heard this recording recently during our meetings, correct? Yes. And before I start the recording, could you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you and Mr. Young were discussing prior to the recording beginning? We were talking about Rio having some Mexicans that he wanted to be robbed, some drug dealers that he wanted to be robbed, and I was explaining to him that Squeaky can get the job done. So, Mr. Young, did Mr. Young raise this idea of robbing some drug dealers? Yes. So he raised this idea to you, and then you began to discuss Squeaky? Yes. And so when we begin the recording, you're speaking at, well, I'll ask you if you recognize the voice, but that's where the recording begins. Is that right? Yes. Your Honor, I'm going to start the recording. So, Mr. Nunnery, I've paused the recording at 31 seconds into the recording. The first person speaking depicted on lines 13 through 17. Do you recognize that voice? Yes. Who is that? That's me. And you said Squeaky has more heart than any one of them motherfucking boys, man. Squeaky got some motherfucking heart, man. What are you referring to there? Well, I was referring to the murder, but disguised as an armed robbery at this point. What do you mean by that? I wasn't directly telling Rio about the murder. I told him that I was talking about an armed robbery, and so that's what I'm explaining. So why didn't you want to tell Rio about a murder you just participated in? Because I didn't want to tell anybody that I had just participated in a murder. And prior to this, you and Rio had discussed robbing a drug dealer, correct? Yes. And so that's how Squeaky's name came up? Yes. Someone willing to do a robbery? Yes. And then the other voice we heard down at lines 29, 30, and 31. Did you recognize that voice? Yeah. And who was that? That's Yeti. Well, let's play a little bit more and see if it becomes more clear. Before we get any further, Mr. Young was working for the government at the time, apparently. Is that correct, Mr. Storino? Yes, Your Honor, yes. All right. He was wired up and he was wearing a recording device for the government, so his statements are not admissible against the defendant. They're only being offered to provide context for the statements made by Mr. Nunnery, but Mr. Young's statements, who was working for the government, those statements are not admissible against the defendant and are only to provide context for the rest of the conversation you're hearing. Proceed. Thank you, Your Honor. So I'm going to pick up the recording again, Mr. Nunnery, at 31 seconds. We are around line 32 or 33. Okay. So, Mr. Nunnery, I've paused the recording again at 1 minute and 24 seconds into the recording, directing you to the last passage, lines 11 through 17. Who was that speaking? That's me. And you're talking about Squeaky here? Yes. And Mr. Nunnery, you say, and they cheated him like a I'd give him 13,000. What did you mean by that? Well, at this time I was talking about the armed robbery. Yes, sir. I'm talking about a murder disguised as an armed robbery. And who are you referring to when you say they cheated him? Bro, man. Cheated who? Squeaky. And how do you think Bro Man cheated Squeaky? I don't think he paid him the amount of money that he received. That Squeaky was owed? Yeah. And later you say, I'm betting you. I ain't hollered at Squeaky, but I'm willing to bet you they ain't give that man no more than 3,000. Yeah. And when you say they ain't give that man no more than 3,000, who is they in that paragraph? Bro, man. I'm going to pick up the recording again at 1 minute and 24 seconds. So, Mr. Nunnery, I've paused it again at 1 minute and 39 seconds. The voice we just heard on lines 26 and 27. Who is that? That's Rio. That's Rio. That's the person who's wearing the wire. Yes. And prior to that, Mr. Nunnery, we have lines ascribed to you. Is that your voice on lines 21 through 24? Yes. And you say it was me, Squeaky, Bro Man in the car together, but Squeaky is the only who got out. Yes. What are you referring to? Again, the murder, but disguised as an armed robbery. Again, this conversation came up about a robbery of some drug dealers that Rio raised? Yes. So when you're saying in the car together, you're referring to being in the car on Whipple when Squeaky ran out and murdered Cato? Yes. So let's pick up again. We're on page 2, line 29, starting the recording at 1 minute and 39 seconds. I've paused it again at 1 minute and 54 seconds. Mr. Nunnery, was that your voice again? Yes. Again you said, but they play Squeaky like a Who's they? Bro man. And what did you mean played squeaky? I didn't think that he got paid. And you said, I don't know what the agreement was between them. When you say them, who are you referring to? Broman and Squeaky. So you were unaware of how much or what money Mr. Span had agreed to pay Squeaky? Yes, I was unaware. Then you said, I didn't have an agreement. I had an agreement with him. Who did you have an agreement with? Broman. Okay. We're going to restart the recording at 1 minute 54 seconds. We're still on page 2 at around line 39. I've paused it again at 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Mr. Nunnery, at the bottom of page 2, lines 42 and 43, you say, but actually he did it though. Who are you referring to? Squeaky. And what are you referring to him doing? Well, the murder, but robbery. Understood. We're going to begin the recording again at 2 minutes and 18 seconds. We're on the top of the 3rd page. So, Mr. Nunnery, I stopped the recording at 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Who was that last voice we just heard? Yeti. And so Yeti, the conversation seems to have shifted. Is that fair? Yes. So Yeti says to Mr. Young, motherfucker's talking about some shit. You're supposed to be trying to get a brother popped off or some shit. Yes. What do you understand Yeti to be referring to there? That somebody had implied that Rio told on somebody. Told somebody what? Told on somebody or tried to get somebody locked up. Told on someone? Yes. So based on your understanding, this is Yeti asking Rio if he was cooperating? Exactly. And you said earlier that you had suspected Rio was cooperating. Yes. Continuing the recording at 2 minutes and 47 seconds. It's around lines 24, 25, and 26 on page 3. The recording ended there. Mr. Nunnery, at the end of the recording, does Mr. Young deny cooperating with law enforcement? Yes. Okay. You can set aside the binder and I'll come get it from you, sir. Okay. Let's have a sidebar for a minute, too.